Hello and welcome to the sixth module of HSM 220. For this class, we'll be discussing policy making, and this class is going to focus on policy making in the United States. So, there are a couple of learning objectives. The first is going to define and describe what policy formulation and modification is, describe the process of a policy cycle, and describe policy making at the federal and state level, and finally identify a couple of special interest groups that influence policy making in the US. So, starting with first objective, this is like a very simplified summary of what the US political system is. You have the federal government, the US federal government, and then you have a couple of other branches with the legislation comprising of the Senate and House of Representation. Then you have the executive branch, where the president and the cabinets stay, and then you have the judicial branch that constitutes the Supreme Court. So, policy making at the federal level focuses a lot on this political system that I've just put forward. It's a little bit different when you start going into the state policy making. So, a couple of terminologies to bear in mind when it comes to policy making. I'm going to kind of briefly, describe what those are. You have agenda setting. So, when we talk about agenda setting, we are basically talking about how health problems are selected as the policy target, because there is a lot of things to address usually, and everything can't be addressed all at once, or even everything can be addressed at all. So there's a process by which in selecting what health problem that is going to be addressed. So that is where agenda setting comes into it. So, and at the agenda setting, that is where you have the issue sorting phase and the public policy issue process. When we say issue sorting, is kind of a little bit like putting a hierarchy on what are we going to focus on now. For instance, it's saying, okay, there are a couple of problems. Let's say we have there's a problem with diabetes, maybe there's a problem with COVID, there's a problem with let's say clean water. Sometimes it's not possible to address all of these problems all at once. So there has to be a way of ranking what is going to be the one to take care of first before you then take care of the other one. So this is kind of where the issue sorting phase comes in, basically in the decision making about what do we put forward and what kind of takes the back seat. And within the agenda setting, that is where you have, some things getting the attention of policymakers, while other things not getting the attention of the policymakers, and therefore become neglected. And a lot of what gets attention and what does not get attention depends a lot on power. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about power later, but just know that having the power beyond just even the political power, but just as a whole, does decide a lot on what gets into the forefront and what kind of gets neglected. And then we have, after agenda setting, we're going to, talk about things like rule making. So what rule making is at this point is, let's say the policy has been made or the law has been signed. Now it has to be, implemented. There's laws generally are not very extensive in its, in terms of defining what it is that needs to be done, because there's only so much you can put forward. So at the point whereby you now tease out the laws and kind of put it in operation terms is where rulemaking comes into play. So let's use, for example, the ACA. And one of the things the ACA did was to make it such that it took out pre-existing condition in the way insurance companies decide who to give who can buy policy, the plans and who cannot in terms of that. So by taking away, removing that pre-existing condition, that's what the law does. Now, where rulemaking is trying to formulate how does this actually play out in reality, in practice. How do you go through the process of removing what pre-existing condition is? What are the things that may qualify as pre-existing, what used to be pre-existing conditions and what did not be pre-existing conditions. So it's basically in trying to tease out the law and make it into smaller morsels that is easier to digest in a way. So and this is where implementing agencies come in. For example, that would be the CDC or the Department of Health and Human Service. So this is where they come in terms of deciding how this is going to be implemented. And another thing that those implementing agencies do is that they have regulatory authority over how the law is going to be enforced and how it's going to be put in place. So once the law has been made at the legislative angle, signed into law by the executive, it is now the implementing agencies that then basically get that, put into effect. It kind of leaves the table of the legislation and the executive, and somebody else then, runs with it, and that somebody else being the implementing agencies. So the agencies spend a lot of time and resources in basically debating all the technical details that come into implementing the policies, because policies are usually not as simple as it may come out in the laws. It's a whole lot more complicated, and trying to figure out, how that is going to actually happen in reality can take a bit of time. If you guys would remember, the time ACA was signed into law in 2010, but its implementation in most states happened in 2014. So it took a little bit of time to go from signing the law to implementing the law, because of all the complexity that comes into, teasing it out into technical details. And then another term you're going to come up, get acquainted with is tabling legislation. So what that means is the action that Congress takes in postponing consideration of legislation. So sometimes it is not all health issues or bills that gets the attention. Some of them get to the point whereby it's presented to the Congress, it's presented to the House of Lords, and it just dies. At that point, it doesn't go further than there. So that is what tabling the legislation is, in terms of the Congress deciding we're not going to take any action on this now. We're just going to put it aside and possibly return to that later. Sometimes they return to it, sometimes they don't. So, and then you have amendments. With amendment is basically what happens is amendment is so either the law has been signed or it is at a period of where some kind of is kind of pushed close to signing, but there needs to be some kind of changes made to it, probably to get more people on board it or make it easier to implement. So that is where amendment comes into. It could also be at a time when the law has been signed into other things then happened, maybe historical events or something happens, and those things that happen do not fit in with the law, with the existing law. So in order to have the law cover all the new areas that suddenly propped up, you then have to go back and amend the law. So that is where amendment comes in. And then finally, you're going to hear vetoing, or you may have already heard it before. So basically, with vetoing is, and this generally goes in the table of the executive branch, whereby they decide this is not going to happen. I know you guys have decided this is a good thing, but this is not going to happen. So it's more or less like, let's use for example the president, a law has been passed and kind of gets to the table of the president, and the president decides I'm not going to sign it into law, and it just kind of stays in there. So that is a kind of vetoing, in a way that it means that the people who have the power to make that decision in terms of vetoing it and saying, okay, this law has been signed, and then you can go ahead and talk about implementation. And let's use, for example, the president decides they're not going to sign it. So that is what it means to veto a law. So that's let's talk a little bit about the policy making cycle. So this is a very simplified view of what the policy making cycle is, and it starts with policy formulation, and this is at the point whereby you decide what the policy is going to be, and all of the agenda setting and agenda setting happens at this point, and you do a lot of back and forth and deciding how this law finally is going to be, and making some amendments in terms of getting more people to kind of buy into it, so that when it goes into the floor, more Congress and legislations are going to vote for it. So that is where policy formulation gets in. So now the policy has been formulated, everything is all good, everybody has voted, and it's all good to go. And now the president has signed it into law. Then you move into policy adoption. So now the policy is going to be adopted either on the federal level or on the state levels. So from there, after the policy is adopted, you then have to implement the law. So after you've done the implementation, you may kind of give yourself a little bit of time in deciding whether the original intent of the policy, or even at the rulemaking, is going to actually work. And then you may want to make some decisions about, okay, this is not working, we're going to make some changes to this, or this is working very well and we're going to carry on, or we're going to do some things to make it even better. So that is in the implementation, evaluation, and then you have the maintenances. Everything is all good. We've decided this works, and now we need to make sure that this policy continues to run as we intended it to run. So this is basically how that goes. So sometimes you could go from policy maintenance and then you go back, and some elements of the policy may need to be formulated. Maybe something comes into place, and then you may need to make some changes to that, and then you may have to go through the whole process again. Or you may just not do that. You could go from policy formulation to maintenance. So it sometimes depends on the law itself and how it's been written out. So this is another example of a policy making policy life cycle and the process of health policy making. This is in the one of the textbooks that talks about how you have from the policy formulation stage, where agenda setting comes in, policy implementation, where rulemaking happens, and policy modification, whereby you do the policy analysis or implementation evaluation, and then you go back and do a feedback if there are some changes that needs to be done. So that is how that process goes. So, and this image more or less like expands a little bit on these different places with formulation, implementation, and modification. So at this point, you're just going to pause this lecture and go through it and really, really read through to kind of make a clearer sense of it. Much of what I've said before already covered, but this kind of expands it a little bit. So with policy formulation, this is where you have agenda setting, you have, you do the development of the legislation, and then but there are some pathways to the agenda setting in terms of what gets into even agenda setting to start with. And this is where you consider things like what is the impact of the health problem. For instance, with COVID, when COVID became a pandemic, it it had to become at the forefront of any policy making, because of how many people that it was affecting and the severity of which it affected them. So the impact of the health problem does decide what gets into agenda setting. Public opinion also comes into place. I'm going to use the example of defund the police. While that has not been done on the federal level, you did have some states and or some smaller agency that made some changes in the way policing happens, and this was driven through public opinion. And then you do have in anything that the president is kind of interested in, that becomes it. For example, if you have presidents that run their campaign on some certain issues, once they have been elected, you have to kind of deliver on those promises that you made during the campaign. So that does decide on what gets into agenda setting, some of the policy positions that presidential candidates or even governorship candidates do use in running for election. And then you do have legislator interest. Some legislators or Congress have their own personal, things that they're really, really passionate about, and they push for those. And they would try to do all the negotiation with their peers. So that does decide what gets into agenda setting. And of course, media coverage. George Floyd did a lot push in terms of policy making when it comes to the defund the police, because there was a lot of push towards that. It kind of fueled public policy, and so because it becomes very difficult for legislators to ignore issues that has been very extensively covered in the media. Otherwise, they start looking like they don't care about the people, which means that when it comes time for the next election, they are probably not going to get re-elected. So that's all the things that do push, that play a part in what gets into agenda setting and what does not. And that I did mention power, and when I say power, is a lot of in this context of who pays the piper calls the tunes. So you do have in terms of legislator interest, whereby you have some people who may have made some contributions to a legislator's re-election campaign or election campaign. The things that those people care about influence what the legislation's interest, because if they want to run for election once again, they need money, and to get money they need to please the people who are funding their campaign or making contributions. So they kind of in this case play a role of a power in deciding who does make an influence. And of course, media coverage, a lot of it has to be do with power. It's not every issue that becomes a national news. Some things just end up in the local news and doesn't get any further. A lot of that has to do with power. Some people have the power to be able to push the things that they care about into media and really get get very good coverage about it. That is where power comes into play. So you see power, playing a lot of role when it comes to agenda setting. So in policy modification, this is where you modify, you do some revisions in the laws on the policy. It could be the entire thing, rarely is the case, but it may be some little pieces of the legislation that needs to be kind of amended in order to make its implementation go a little bit smoother. And policy modification typically takes place after implementation. Let's say you've done the evaluation, and in the evaluation and in the analysis, you discover some things are not working as well as we thought it's going to work. Then you make amendments or you modify the laws. And sometimes modification can happen in agenda setting, depending on who you are trying to get to care about the health problem that you want. If you don't get enough people to care about it, or to care about it in its original form, you may need to make some adjustments to that. The ACA that got passed into law is not the way the ACA started. There was a lot of changes, modification that had to be done to it in order to kind of get other people's buy-in in that. So that is what I mean by policy modification. It also goes into legislation development, or in the rulemaking part of it, whereby you're trying to do all the teasing out in details in deciding, okay, this may not quite work in this way, or you may look at the way the law is written, and it's written in such a way that some things can fit in with what the law is, and some things may not quite fit in. So the interpretation of the law may have modification happening at that place. And okay, during rulemaking, and of course in the operation being the implementation. So why is there any need to modify the law? Some of it comes with the consequence of implementation. You could find that during implementation, some things just don't work. Or you could find that during implementation, big problems crop up that was not anticipated. So you have to make changes. And in the policy analysis and evaluation, you find out, some things we thought was going to work out is not going to work out. Or there's not enough money to be able to implement the law as it is, and some adjustments need to be made. So that's where you have, or the interest of the people changes. The things that people cared about in the beginning of the, let's say when the agenda setting was done, is not what people care about afterwards. Maybe they decide to care about something else. So you may need to, amend the law because in order to meet that. Then you can have special interest groups getting involved. And this is at the point where you're doing trading in terms of deciding which aspects of the law to keep and which aspects of the law to modify a little bit. And a lot of that has to do with the people who are, those who are playing the piper, who are paying the piper. That's where they involvement do come in. And then you could have oversight. You could have the Supreme Court saying, nope, even though you have put this in the law, this is not going to fly. It goes against the Constitution. So you have that. For example, you had the individual mandate that the Supreme Courts kind of struck out, and so you have those kind of changes. And then you could have the incrementation nature of policy development. What we kind of find that we could do more with the policy than what was originally conceived. So that is where you have that. So how does policy making happen? What is the policy making process? On the federal level, this is how it goes. It starts with the bill being introduced into Congress. So both what bill gets introduced to the Congress, that's where agenda setting comes in, and how the Congress receives the bill, and whether there's going to be changes in as a result of negotiation within the Congress. That's where agenda setting comes in. That's, you have the bill introduced to Congress, and then is assigned to congressional committee if there's hope that it's going to get passed. And then upon committee approval, the bill is kind of scheduled for congressional consideration. And if all goes well, it gets passed in the Congress, and then it gets presented to the president. And if the president, decides not to veto it, it gets signed into law. So this is a very, very simplified process of the legislative, how policy making is done at the legislative end, especially at the Congress level. Some legislation starts with the House of Representatives before it gets into the Congress. But this process is just kind of focusing on how it happens within the Congress. And so this is how policy making process happens in the state. First of all, the political system in the states does mirror that of the federal government. You have the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, and you have the supreme judicial branch. You have the Supreme Court within the states, and then you have the overall Supreme Court. So it kind of very much mirrors how it looks like on the federal level. And also, therefore, policy making also does kind of happen in a similar way. So, what are some of the constraints that comes with making policy at the federal level? You have states legislations are kind of preempted on the federal level. What becomes, especially for some federal laws that cover all states, the states kind of have to adopt it. So after it gets signed by the federal, you then have to adopt it within the states. That's how the US political system is set up. So, and sometimes the states may decide that no, we don't want to adopt what you said that you're going to adopt. An example being what happened with Texas and a number of the southern states that decided they were not going to adopt Medicaid expansion. So that is where nullification does come in, whereby states, have the right to decide they are not going to adopt a federal law because it's deemed to be unconstitutional. As opposed to, so that's when nullification happens. So there are two, sources you can click to kind of learn more. The second one kind of focuses on the ACA, some of the things that happen with the ACA. So, you do have, the process of the policy making with the governor at the state level. Let's say the state has decided to adopt a law at the federal level. Now they have to kind of, go through the process of, getting that also allowing this times. But you do have some laws that are strictly on the state level. They don't have anything to do with the federal, and the process at which they get signed is very much similar to how it happens at the federal level. You have the law, is drafted, is presented to the Congress, you have the reading, the voting, and then finally signed into law, whereby if the governor decides to veto it, it kind of dies there and it kind of moves away. So that is very, very similar to how it happens in the federal level. So special interest groups. I did mention who pays the piper, and this has to do with who decides what gets in. And the people who pays the piper has a lot of power in deciding both how agenda setting happens and how implementation happens. They do kind of have a lot of power, and this is a lot of the times it is stakeholders. They have a stake in both the policies that get passed and how the policies get implemented. So what happens is that these individuals or entities, sometimes association, they have a direct or indirect role in the development of policies. For instance, they can lobby in terms of getting some laws into drumming up interest in the law, or also if a law, not necessarily in drumming up the interest, in deciding they want to kill a law that is being considered, and they will go in and lobby everybody to say when this gets into voting, vote against it. So they have a lot of power in that sense. The influences that they have, they play a lot of role in formulation of the policies, implementing the policy, modifying the policy. So these folks, they have a lot of power when it comes to deciding what gets done and what does not. And they are, for the most part, kind of interest groups because they're able to band together. So they have a common view on specific topics of the policies and how it's going to be regulated. For a lot of the times, they're trying to protect their own interests in terms of, if it, let's use for example, if it's a private company that knows that if a certain law is passed, it's going to affect the way they do their business, they have an interest in trying to get that law to not get passed, or even if there is no way of not preventing it from being passed, making it get kind of a diluted version of it whereby it doesn't affect them very adversely. So members of the interest group, they generally work together to make sure that their views get reflected in the law. And the most basic interest role of the interest group is to influence policy in terms of they play a role in agenda setting, in rule making, and in formulation or in modification, or trying to make sure that things go in their favor, or it goes along with the values that those interest group hold. And they do this by lobbying. And so I'm not going to focus a lot on lobbying in terms of describing it, but just know that special interest group push for the things that, benefit them, or is not going to adversely, be at their detriment through lobbying. And there's a number of those special interest groups that, we have the Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers of America, America Hospital Association, and you have the private health research institutes. You have a couple of private health foundations, and then you have private industries. An example would be tech companies. So this is where we end for today's class. This topic is a little bit longer than others, and that's because we had a lot of things to cover in it. So if you have any questions regarding anything that's been covered in this class, always remember you can just post the question. Do have a lovely day. Bye.